Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the quiet forest clearings of pre-colonial North America, where the morning mist still clings to ancient oak trees, and the only sounds are the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk. You're about to witness something that modern humans have almost entirely forgotten. The painstaking meditative art of crafting a single perfect arrow, a process so intricate and time-consuming that it could take a skilled Native American warrior anywhere from several weeks to multiple months to complete just one. You probably won't survive the sheer patience required for this level of craftsmanship, especially in our instant gratification world, where we get frustrated if a web page takes more than 3 seconds to load. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake before dawn in your village nestled beside a winding river, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The leaves haven't yet begun their spectacular transformation, but you can sense the changing season in the way the morning light slants differently through the canopy above. Today marks the beginning of what will become one of the most important projects of your life as a young warrior, the creation of your first truly perfect hunting arrow. Your grandfather, a master craftsman whose weathered hands have shaped thousands of arrows over his 70 winters, has finally deemed you ready for this sacred undertaking. You step outside your family's long house, your bare feet silent on the dew-dampened earth. The village is still largely asleep, save for the elderly grandmother who tends the central fire and nods knowingly as you pass. She understands the significance of this day, having watched generations of young warriors embark on this same journey toward mastery. The path to the forest is one you've walked countless times, but today it feels different, weighted with purpose and anticipation. Your first task, your grandfather explained yesterday evening as the fire crackled between you, is to find the perfect shaft material. This isn't simply a matter of walking into the woods and selecting any straight branch. No, you must search for a specific type of wood, preferably dogwood, though ash, birch, or certain varieties of pine will suffice, that meets exacting criteria developed over countless generations of trial and error. The wood must be straight, yes, but it must also be the right age, harvested at the proper time of year, and possess the correct density and flexibility. You make your way deeper into the forest, your trained eyes scanning the undergrowth, with the patience of someone who has learned that rushing leads only to disappointment. The morning sun filters through the canopy in golden shafts, illuminating patches of forest floor where wildflowers still bloom despite the advancing season. You pause beside a promising dogwood sapling, running your fingers along its length, feeling for the subtle irregularities that would make it unsuitable. This one has a slight bend near the middle, imperceptible to an untrained eye, but enough to affect the arrow's flight. You move on. Hours pass in this methodical search. You examine dozens of potential candidates, each one teaching you something new about the relationship between wood grain, growing conditions, and structural integrity. Your grandfather's voice echoes in your memory, recounting the old stories of master arrow makers who would search for months to find wood that met their exacting standards. Some would travel for days, visiting specific groves known for producing exceptional shaft material, trading with distant tribes for access to their most prized wood sources. Finally, as the sun reaches its zenith, you discover what you've been seeking: a young dogwood shoot, perfectly straight, growing in just the right amount of sunlight to have developed the ideal balance of strength and flexibility. You offer a quiet prayer of gratitude to the tree's spirit before carefully cutting it with your sharp flint knife, taking care not to damage the remaining plant so it can continue to grow and perhaps provide material for future arrows. The walk back to your village is contemplative, the precious shaft cradled carefully in your hands. You already know that the real work is only beginning. What follows will be weeks of patient, meticulous preparation that will test not only your skill but your character, your ability to maintain focus and dedication when the work becomes tedious and repetitive. Back in your family's dwelling, you clear a space in the corner that will become your workshop for the duration of this project. Your grandfather joins you, settling onto a woven mat with the slow, deliberate movements of age. He examines your chosen shaft with the same careful attention he once applied to evaluating war ponies, running his gnarled fingers along its length, holding it up to the light streaming through the smoke hole above. "Good," he says, finally. A single word that carries the weight of approval from a master craftsman. The first step in the actual crafting process is debarking, removing the outer layer of bark to reveal the clean wood beneath. This might sound simple, but like everything else in arrow making, it requires patience and precision. You must remove the bark without gouging or scoring the wood underneath, maintaining the shaft's structural integrity while creating a smooth, workable surface. You begin with your knife, making shallow cuts in a spiral pattern around the shaft, then carefully peeling away strips of bark. The work is meditative, requiring just enough concentration to quiet the chatter of your mind, while allowing your hands to develop the muscle memory that will serve you throughout this process. Your grandfather watches silently, occasionally offering gentle corrections to your technique. "Feel the wood," he instructs. "Let it tell you how it wants to be worked. Every tree is different. Every piece of wood has its own personality. The mark of a true craftsman is learning to listen to these subtle differences." The debarking alone takes the better part of 2 days, not because the physical act is particularly difficult, but because rushing would risk damaging the shaft, forcing you to start over with a new piece of wood. This is your first lesson in the patience that will define this entire endeavor. In your modern world, you might expect to complete such a task in minutes, but here, in this time when quality mattered more than speed, you're learning to work at the pace demanded by the materials themselves. With the bark removed, the shaft must now be properly seasoned, dried slowly and evenly to prevent cracking or warping. Your grandfather shows you how to hang it in the precise center of your family's dwelling, suspended by sinew cord in a position where it will be exposed to gentle, consistent heat from the central fire without being too close to risk scorching. The wood must give up its moisture gradually, he explains, settling back onto his mat. Too fast, and it will crack. Too slow, and it may warp or develop weak spots. This part of the process cannot be hurried, no matter how eager you might be to continue. And so begins the first of many waiting periods that will punctuate this project. Each day you check the shaft's progress, gently testing its flexibility, looking for any signs that the drying process isn't proceeding correctly. You rotate it regularly to ensure even exposure to the warm air circulating through the dwelling. This daily ritual becomes as much a part of your routine as eating or sleeping. During these waiting periods, your grandfather begins teaching you about the other components that will eventually become part of your finished arrow. An arrow, he explains, is far more than just a straight stick with a sharp point. It's a complex projectile whose every element must work in perfect harmony to achieve accuracy, penetration, and consistent performance. The shaft is like the backbone of a warrior. He tells you one evening as the two of you sit by the fire, it must be strong enough to withstand the stress of launch, flexible enough not to break on impact, and perfectly balanced to fly true. But a backbone alone does not make a warrior. It must be joined by other elements. The point that penetrates, the fletching that guides, the knock that connects to the bowstring. Each of these components is critical, and each requires its own specialized knowledge and skill to create properly. As your shaft continues its slow drying process, your grandfather introduces you to the art of point making. In your tribe, arrow points are crafted from carefully selected pieces of flint, chert, or obsidian materials that can be worked into razor-sharp edges that will penetrate hide, muscle, and bone with devastating effectiveness. The process of creating these points, known as knapping, is an ancient art form that requires years to master and represents some of humanity's earliest technological achievements. Your grandfather leads you to a special area, outside the village, where generations of craftsmen have practiced their knapping skills. The ground is littered with stone chips and failed attempts, creating an archaeology of learning that stretches back countless years. He selects a piece of high-quality flint from his personal collection, a nodule no larger than your fist, but possessed of the fine grain and consistent structure necessary for creating superior points. Watch closely, he instructs, settling cross-legged on the ground with the stone balanced in his lap. What I'm about to show you has been passed down through our family for more generations than we can count. Each movement, each strike, carries the wisdom of our ancestors. He begins with what's called roughing out, using a hammer stone to break away large flakes from the flint nodule, gradually shaping it into the basic outline of an arrow point. Each strike must be precisely placed and delivered with exactly the right amount of force, too soft, and the flake won't detach cleanly, too hard, and the entire piece might shatter, wasting precious material and requiring a fresh start. You watch in fascination as your grandfather's hands work with the unconscious precision that comes only from decades of practice. The rhythmic percussion of stone against stone creates a meditation all its own, punctuated by the soft whisper of flakes falling to the ground. Gradually, the rough nodule begins to take shape, revealing the elegant form that was hidden within the raw material. The stone wants to break in certain ways. Your grandfather explains between strikes. Our job is not to force it into the shape we desire, but to guide it toward the form it's naturally inclined to take. This requires understanding the internal structure of the stone, reading the grain and the stress patterns like you might read tracks in soft earth. This roughing out process alone takes several hours. When your grandfather finally sets down his hammer stone, what remains is a crude but recognizable arrow point, thick, roughly shaped, with jagged edges that will require considerable refinement before they're suitable for hunting. This is where the real artistry begins. The next phase involves pressure flaking. using tools made from antler, bone, or hard wood to carefully remove small, precise flakes from the point's edges. This process transforms the rough blank into a finished tool with razor-sharp cutting edges and a perfectly symmetrical form. Your grandfather demonstrates the technique using a pointed antler tine to apply pressure at exactly the right angle to detach tiny flakes of stone. Each flake must be planned, he says, pausing to examine the point's edge in the afternoon light. You must visualize not just the flake you're about to remove, but the 3 or 4 flakes that will follow it. The edge is built up gradually, like adding layers to a song, each note dependent on those that came before. You spend the next several days learning the basics of pressure flaking, working with practice pieces under your grandfather's patient guidance. Your early attempts are clumsy and imprecise, resulting in points that are functional but lack the elegant symmetry of your grandfather's work. He encourages you to persist, reminding you that even the most skilled craftsmen in your tribe required years to develop true mastery. Your hands are learning a new language, he tells you after examining one of your practice points. Like any language, it takes time to develop fluency. Be patient with yourself, but never accept work that is less than your current best effort. Meanwhile, your arrow shaft continues its slow drying process. Each day, you check its progress, noting how the wood gradually changes color as its moisture content decreases. The surface becomes harder, more polished looking, and when you tap it with your fingernail, the sound becomes increasingly clear and resonant. Your grandfather tests it periodically, bending it slightly to gauge its flexibility and checking for any signs of developing cracks or weak spots. 3 weeks into the drying process, he declares the shaft ready for the next phase of preparation. Now comes the careful work of straightening and shaping, removing any minor irregularities that remain and creating the perfectly uniform taper that will help ensure consistent flight characteristics. This work is performed using a combination of scraping tools and careful application of heat. Your grandfather shows you how to hold the shaft over the glowing coals of your fire, warming specific sections that need to be bent or adjusted. The heat makes the wood temporarily pliable, allowing you to make gentle corrections to its straightness. Too much heat will scorch or weaken the wood, too little will have no effect. Finding the right balance requires experience and intuition that can't be taught through words alone. You spend hours learning to read the subtle signs that indicate when the wood is at the perfect temperature for adjustment. The slight darkening of the surface, the barely perceptible smell of heated cellulose, the way the shaft feels in your hands when it reaches the optimal level of pliability. Each section of the shaft must be heated and adjusted individually, with careful attention paid to maintaining the overall straightness and structural integrity. The scraping process that follows is equally demanding. Using tools made from sharp flint flakes hafted to wooden handles, you gradually remove tiny amounts of material to create the arrow's final shape. The shaft must taper slightly from the knock end toward the point, thick enough at the back to withstand the stress of being launched from a powerful bow, thin enough at the front to minimize weight and air resistance during flight. This tapering must be perfectly uniform around the shaft's circumference. Even small variations in thickness can cause the arrow to wobble during flight, destroying its accuracy. You learn to check your progress constantly, rolling the shaft between your palms to feel for irregularities, sighting down its length to ensure perfect straightness. using your fingertips to detect variations in diameter that might be invisible to the eye. Your grandfather watches this process with the patience of someone who has guided many young craftsmen through these same challenges. He offers suggestions and corrections, but increasingly allows you to make your own judgments about the work's progress. This is part of the learning process, developing the internal standards and self-critical abilities that will serve you throughout your life as a craftsman. The arrow will teach you as much as I can, he observes one afternoon. You carefully scrape away another paper-thin curl of wood. Listen to what it tells you about its own needs and desires. Every piece of wood is different, and what works for one shaft may not work for another. As the shaft nears completion, your attention turns to creating the knock, the small groove at the arrow's back end that will fit against your bowstring during the shooting process. This groove must be precisely cut to the correct depth and width. Too shallow, and the arrow may slip from the string at the moment of release. Too deep, and the shaft may be weakened to the point of breaking under stress. Your grandfather demonstrates the technique using a thin flint blade, cutting a shallow groove perpendicular to the shaft's axis. The cut must be perfectly centered and aligned, requiring steady hands and careful attention to detail. He shows you how to test the fit against your bowstring, adjusting the groove's depth and width until the arrow sits securely without being too tight. The knock is the connection point between archer and arrow, he explains. It must be strong enough to withstand the violence of release, yet smooth enough not to interfere with the arrow's departure from the string. Finding this balance is one of the most critical aspects of arrow making. You practice cutting nocks on several test pieces before attempting the final cut on your precious shaft. Each practice attempt teaches you something new about the relationship between blade angle, cutting pressure, and wood grain. Your grandfather encourages you to take your time, reminding you that a single mistaken cut could ruin weeks of careful work. When you finally make the actual knock cut, your hands are steady with confidence earned through practice. The blade bites cleanly into the wood, creating a groove that's perfectly shaped and positioned. You test the fit against your bowstring multiple times, making tiny adjustments until the arrow sits with exactly the right tension. With the shaft complete, your attention turns to fletching, the feathers that will stabilize the arrow during flight. This is perhaps the most complex aspect of arrow making, requiring not only technical skill but also deep understanding of aerodynamics and projectile physics that your ancestors developed through centuries of experimentation and refinement. Your grandfather leads you on an expedition to find suitable feathers. Not just any feathers will do. They must come from specific types of birds, harvested at the right time of year, selected for their size, shape, and structural characteristics. The primary wing feathers of large birds like eagles, hawks, or wild turkeys are preferred, as they provide the right combination of size, strength, and aerodynamic efficiency. Finding these feathers requires knowledge of bird behavior, hunting skills, and sometimes considerable luck. Eagles and hawks are powerful, intelligent creatures that don't surrender their feathers easily. Your tribe has traditional methods for acquiring these precious materials, sometimes through hunting, sometimes through trading with other groups, sometimes through careful collection of naturally molted feathers found in nesting areas. On this particular expedition, you're fortunate to discover several excellent hawk feathers that were shed naturally during the recent molting season. Your grandfather examines each one carefully, looking for signs of damage, weakness, or structural flaws that might affect their performance. He selects 3 feathers that match closely in size and shape, explaining that consistency among the fletching elements is crucial for stable arrow flight. Each feather has a natural curve, he points out, holding one up to demonstrate. This curve must be oriented correctly on the arrow shaft to create the proper spin during flight. The arrow will naturally rotate as it flies, and this rotation stabilizes its trajectory, much like the spin on a thrown spear. Back in your workshop, your grandfather begins the intricate process of preparing the feathers for attachment. First, they must be split down their central shaft, creating 2 matching halves from each primary feather. This splitting must be done with extreme care to avoid damaging the delicate barbs that give the feather its aerodynamic properties. Using a sharp obsidian blade, he demonstrates the technique for splitting feathers, starting at the quill end and working carefully toward the tip. The cut must follow the natural line of the feather's central shaft, maintaining the structural integrity of both halves. Even experienced craftsmen occasionally ruin feathers during this process, so your grandfather works with deliberate, unhurried precision. You watch as he prepares multiple sets of fletching, creating extras in case mistakes occur during the attachment process. Each feather half is trimmed to the proper length and shaped to the specific profile that your tribe has found most effective for hunting arrows. The exact shape varies depending on the arrow's intended use. Broad, low-profile fletching for close-range hunting, narrower, high-profile fletching for long-distance shots. The actual attachment of fletching to the arrow shaft is accomplished using sinew thread and pine pitch adhesive. The sinew processed from the back tendons of deer or elk provides incredibly strong and durable binding when properly prepared. The pine pitch, collected from certain species of evergreen trees and refined through careful heating, creates a waterproof seal that protects the binding from moisture and wear. Your grandfather shows you how to position the fletching elements around the shaft's circumference, spacing them at precise 120-degree intervals for optimal stability. Each feather must be aligned perfectly parallel to the shaft's axis, with its natural curve oriented to create the desired spin direction. The slightest misalignment can cause erratic flight behavior that will make accurate shooting impossible. The binding process itself requires extraordinary patience and attention to detail. Starting at the rear of the fletching area, thin sinew threads are wrapped around the shaft in a complex pattern that secures each feather while maintaining the precise spacing and alignment. The tension must be consistent throughout the binding, tight enough to hold the feathers securely, but not so tight as to compress or damage their delicate structure. This wrapping process can take several hours per arrow, with each thread laid down deliberately and checked for proper positioning before the next is added. Your grandfather demonstrates the traditional wrapping patterns, explaining how each configuration serves a specific purpose in distributing stress and maintaining the fletching's structural integrity over time. The ancestors who developed these techniques understood forces that your modern engineers are only beginning to rediscover. He tells you as his hands work with unconscious precision, they learned through generations of trial and error how to balance strength, flexibility, and aerodynamic efficiency in ways that maximize the arrow's performance. As the sinew wrapping nears completion, pine pitch is carefully applied to seal and waterproof the binding. The pitch must be heated to the correct consistency, liquid enough to penetrate the sinew wrapping, but not so hot as to damage the feathers or weaken the thread. Your grandfather demonstrates the proper technique, using a small stick to apply the pitch in thin, even coats that soak into the binding without creating unsightly buildup. The pitch application alone takes most of a day, as each coat must dry completely before the next is applied. 3 or 4 coats are typically required to create a properly sealed and protected binding. Between coats, you carefully inspect the work for any gaps or areas that might need additional attention. While the fletching dries and cures, your attention returns to the arrow point that you've been working on during the weeks of shaft preparation. By now, your napping skills have improved considerably through daily practice, and the point is nearing completion. The rough blank has been transformed into a recognizable arrowhead with sharp cutting edges and a symmetrical profile. The final stages of point making require the most delicate and precise work. Using increasingly fine pressure flaking techniques, you remove tiny flakes to create the final edge geometry and surface finish. The cutting edges must be sharp enough to penetrate hide and bone, but not so thin as to be fragile. Finding this balance requires understanding the relationship between edge angle, material properties, and intended use. Your grandfather guides you through this final refinement process, teaching you to recognize the subtle signs that indicate when an edge has reached optimal sharpness, the sound the stone makes when struck, the way light reflects from its surface, the feel of the edge against your fingertip. All of these provide information about the point's readiness for use. A properly made point will cut through a deer hide as easily as your knife cuts through soft leather, he explains, testing one of the practice points you've been working on. But it must also be strong enough to penetrate bone without breaking. This balance between sharpness and durability is what separates a master's work from that of a novice. The hafting process, attaching the completed point to the arrow shaft, represents the final critical step in your arrow's construction. This connection must be incredibly strong, as it will experience tremendous stress when the arrow strikes its target. The hafting method used by your tribe involves splitting the shaft end, inserting the point's tang, and securing everything with sinew wrapping and adhesive. Your grandfather demonstrates the technique for splitting the shaft end without weakening the wood. Using a sharp blade, he makes a careful cut along the grain, creating a slot just deep enough and wide enough to accept the point's tang. The fit must be precise, tight enough to hold the point securely, but not so tight as to split the shaft when the tang is inserted. Test fitting the point requires multiple small adjustments to achieve the perfect match between tang and slot. Too loose, and the point may work free during use. Too tight, and the shaft may crack when the point is seated. Your grandfather teaches you to make these adjustments gradually, removing tiny amounts of material until the fit is exactly right. The actual assembly involves coating the tang with pine pitch adhesive before insertion, then wrapping the joint with sinew thread to provide additional mechanical security. This wrapping follows specific patterns developed over generations of experimentation, distributing stress loads in ways that maximize the joint's strength and durability. As you carefully wrap sinew around the hafted point, your grandfather shares stories of famous arrows from your tribe's history, projectiles that brought down legendary game animals or played crucial roles in important hunts. These stories aren't just entertainment. They're part of the oral tradition that preserves technical knowledge and cultural values for future generations. Each arrow carries the spirit of its maker, He tells you as you apply the final protective coating of pine pitch. When you release this arrow from your bow, part of your own essence travels with it. This is why we take such care in its creation. We are not just making a tool, but extending our own presence into the world. The completed arrow must now undergo a curing period, allowing all the adhesives to reach full strength and the various components to settle into their final positions. During this time, you perform daily inspections, checking for any signs of loosening, cracking, or other problems that might indicate the need for repairs. Your grandfather uses this waiting period to teach you about arrow storage and maintenance. Properly made arrows can last for years if cared for correctly, but they require regular attention to maintain their performance characteristics. The wood must be protected from excessive moisture and rapid temperature changes. The fletching needs periodic inspection and repair. The point must be kept sharp and properly aligned. An arrow is never truly finished. He explains one evening as you carefully examine your creation for any signs of wear or damage. It continues to change and age throughout its life, and a good archer learns to read these changes and respond appropriately. Some of my oldest arrows have been repaired and modified many times, but they still fly as true as the day they were first completed. As the curing period nears its end, your grandfather begins preparing you for the most important test of your craftsmanship, actually shooting the arrow to evaluate its performance. This isn't simply a matter of drawing your bow and releasing the string. Proper arrow testing requires systematic evaluation of flight characteristics, accuracy, and consistency under various conditions. The testing process begins with close-range shots at soft targets that won't damage the arrow. If problems are discovered, your grandfather watches carefully as you draw the arrow for the first time, noting how it sits on the bowstring, how it feels as you come to full draw, and how it behaves during the release process. The arrow's first flight is a moment of truth that reveals whether weeks of careful work have resulted in success or whether adjustments are still needed. You draw your bow with the reverence appropriate to this significant moment, feeling the familiar tension build in your muscles as the string comes back to your anchor point. The arrow sits perfectly against the string, its nock holding securely without excessive tightness. At the moment of release, everything comes together in a fraction of a second that represents the culmination of months of learning and preparation. The string snaps forward, imparting its energy to the arrow through the precisely cut nock. The shaft flexes slightly as it accelerates, then stabilizes as the fletching begins to do its work. The arrow flies straight and true, striking the target with the solid thunk that indicates proper penetration and energy transfer. Your grandfather nods approvingly as you both examine the arrow's performance. The flight was stable, the accuracy acceptable for a first test, and the arrow showed no signs of structural problems during launch or impact. These are all positive signs, but the testing process is far from complete. Over the following days, you conduct increasingly demanding tests of your arrow's capabilities, long-range shots to evaluate how well it maintains accuracy over distance, shots at different angles to test performance under varied conditions, repeated shots to check for consistency and durability. Each test provides data about the arrow's characteristics and helps you understand how it differs from other arrows in your collection. Through this testing process, you begin to develop the intimate knowledge of your arrow that will make you a more effective archer. Every projectile has its own personality. Slight variations in balance, flight characteristics, and performance that must be understood and accommodated. Learning to read these individual traits is part of becoming a master archer. Your grandfather shares his own experiences with arrow testing and evaluation, describing how different environmental conditions can affect performance, how to recognize signs of developing problems before they become serious, and how to make minor adjustments that can improve an arrow's accuracy or consistency. The relationship between archer and arrow is like a partnership. He explains as you examine the results of a particularly good shooting session. Each must understand and complement the other's characteristics. Your job as an archer is not to force the arrow to do what you want. As your testing program continues, you make small adjustments and refinements based on what you learn about the arrow's behavior. Perhaps the fletching needs slight trimming to reduce drag. Maybe the knock could be deepened slightly to improve string release. These minor modifications are part of the ongoing process of optimization that continues throughout an arrow's useful life. The knowledge you gain through this process extends far beyond the single arrow you've created. Each technique you've learned, each problem you've solved, each insight you've gained contributes to your growing understanding of the arrow maker's art. This knowledge will inform every future project, helping you work more efficiently and achieve better results. Your grandfather recognizes this growing mastery and begins sharing more advanced techniques and concepts. He shows you how different wood species affect arrow performance, how variations in point design influence penetration characteristics, how fletching configurations can be optimized for specific hunting situations. This advanced knowledge represents the culmination of a lifetime's experience and study. True mastery comes not from following rigid rules, but from understanding the principles that underlie those rules. He tells you during one of these advanced lessons, once you understand why things work the way they do, you can begin to innovate and adapt, creating solutions for new challenges that previous generations never faced. As autumn progresses toward winter, your arrow's testing and refinement process nears completion. The projectile that began as a simple piece of wood has been transformed into a precision instrument capable of taking game at considerable distances. More importantly, you have been transformed as well from someone who used arrows to someone who truly understands them. The months of patient work have taught you lessons that extend far beyond arrow making. You've learned about the value of patience, the importance of attention to detail, the satisfaction that comes from creating something beautiful and functional with your own hands. These lessons will serve you throughout your life, whether you're crafting arrows, hunting game, or facing any of the countless challenges that await a young warrior. Your grandfather performs a final inspection of your completed arrow, examining every detail with the critical eye of a master craftsman. He checks the straightness of the shaft, the precision of the knock cut, the symmetry of the fletching, the sharpness of the point, the quality of all the bindings and joints. His examination is thorough and exacting, but when he finally nods his approval, you know that your work has met the highest standards of your craft. This arrow is worthy of a warrior, he declares, returning it to your hands with ceremony appropriate to the moment. It will serve you well in hunt and battle, but more importantly, the knowledge you gained in its creation will serve you for the rest of your life. You are no longer simply a user of arrows. You are now a maker of arrows, a keeper of ancient knowledge, a link in the chain that connects us to our ancestors and will connect you to your descendants. The completed arrow becomes more than just a hunting tool. It becomes a symbol of your passage from apprentice to craftsman, from student to practitioner of an ancient art. When you hold it, you feel the weight not just of its physical materials, but of the knowledge and tradition it represents. Every smooth curve of its shaft, every precisely placed feather, every sharp facet of its point tells the story of skills passed down through countless generations. In the quiet moments before sleep, you often find yourself holding this first arrow, running your fingers along its familiar contours, remembering the lessons learned during its creation. The patience required for proper wood seasoning taught you that some things cannot be rushed. The precision demanded by fletching attachment showed you the importance of attention to detail. The strength needed for point napping demonstrated that excellence requires effort and perseverance. These lessons resonate through every aspect of your life as a warrior and hunter. When tracking game through dense forest, you apply the same patient observation skills you learned while selecting shaft wood. When preparing for important hunts, you use the same methodical planning approach that guided your arrow's construction. When facing challenges that seem overwhelming, you remember the way complex projects can be broken down into manageable steps, each building on the previous one toward eventual success. Your grandfather watches with satisfaction as you begin applying these lessons to other aspects of your life. He sees how the discipline learned through arrow making influences your approach to combat training, your relationships with other tribal members, your understanding of your place in the natural world. This broader impact was always part of his intention. Teaching arrow making was never just about creating better projectiles, but about shaping better people. As winter settles over your homeland, you begin working on your second arrow, applying the knowledge gained through your first project, while exploring new challenges and refinements. This second arrow will be different from the first, not because the basic techniques have changed, but because your understanding has deepened. You see possibilities now that were invisible during your initial learning period. You understand relationships between design elements that were previously mysterious. The second arrow teaches you new lessons about variation and adaptation. No two pieces of wood are exactly alike. No two birds produce identical feathers. No two pieces of stone nap in precisely the same manner. Learning to work with these natural variations, to adapt your techniques to the materials at hand, rather than forcing materials to conform to rigid specifications, represents another level of mastery. Your grandfather introduces increasingly sophisticated concepts as your skills develop. He explains how seasonal changes affect wood properties, how different hunting situations call for different arrow designs, how climate and altitude influence flight characteristics. This advanced knowledge transforms arrow making from a craft based on rote following of procedures into an art form requiring creativity, problem solving, and deep understanding of underlying principles. Through long winter evenings by the fire, he shares stories of legendary arrow makers from your tribe's history, craftsmen whose skills became the stuff of legend, whose arrows were sought by warriors from distant tribes, whose innovations influenced arrow-making techniques for generations. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're inspiration and instruction, showing you the heights of excellence that dedicated craftsmen can achieve. The greatest arrow makers of our people were not just technically skilled. Your grandfather explains during one of these storytelling sessions, they were innovators who understood their craft so deeply that they could improve upon tradition while still respecting its wisdom. They knew when to follow ancient methods and when to experiment with new approaches. As spring returns to your homeland, you've completed several arrows of increasingly sophisticated design and superior performance. Each one has taught you something new about your craft, your materials, and yourself. The collection represents not just a supply of hunting equipment, but a record of your growing mastery and understanding. Your reputation as a skilled arrow maker begins to spread beyond your immediate family. Other young warriors seek your advice on their own projects. Experienced hunters examine your work with respect and approval. Your grandfather begins sending you to trade with other tribes, where your arrows are recognized as products of exceptional quality and craftsmanship. This recognition brings both pride and responsibility. You understand now that you're not just creating arrows for your own use, but serving as a representative of your tribe's traditions and standards. Every arrow you make reflects not only your personal skill, but the quality of teaching you received and the ancient knowledge you're helping to preserve. The responsibility extends beyond individual arrows to the preservation and transmission of knowledge itself. Your grandfather begins involving you in the instruction of newer apprentices, teaching you how to share what you've learned in ways that honor the tradition while accommodating different learning styles and natural abilities. Knowledge that is not shared will die with its keeper. He reminds you as you help a younger cousin through his first attempts at pressure flaking. Our ancestors live on through the skills they passed to us, and we will live on through the skills we pass to others. This is how tradition survives and grows stronger with each generation. Teaching others forces you to examine your own understanding more deeply. When your cousin struggles with concepts that now seem natural to you, you must find new ways to explain principles you've internalized through practice. This process of explanation deepens your own comprehension, revealing aspects of arrow making that you understood intuitively, but had never articulated clearly. You discover that different students learn in different ways. Some respond best to detailed verbal explanations. Others need to see demonstrations repeated multiple times. Still others learn most effectively through hands-on experimentation with gentle guidance. Adapting your teaching approach to accommodate these different learning styles becomes part of your own continuing education in the arrow maker's art. Your grandfather watches approvingly as you develop these teaching skills. He sees the completion of a cycle that began when you first approached him as an eager but ignorant apprentice. Now you're becoming a link in the chain of knowledge transmission that stretches back through countless generations and will continue long after you've joined the ancestors. The seasons cycle through their ancient patterns as your mastery continues to deepen. Each hunting season brings new challenges that test your arrow's performance and reveal opportunities for improvement. A particularly tough-hided elk teaches you about point design and penetration mechanics. A long shot at a wary deer demonstrates the importance of perfect fletching alignment. A hunt in windy conditions shows you how environmental factors affect arrow flight. These real-world experiences complement your theoretical knowledge, creating the kind of deep, practical understanding that can only come from years of dedicated practice. You begin to develop an intuitive sense for how different design choices will affect performance under various conditions. This intuition, built on a foundation of solid technical knowledge, represents the highest level of craftsman mastery. Your arrows become known throughout your tribe for their exceptional quality and consistency. Veteran hunters specifically request arrows from your workshop, knowing that your projectiles will perform reliably when their lives depend on accurate shooting. This reputation brings both pride and pressure, Every arrow you make must live up to the standards that have made your name synonymous with excellence. The pressure proves beneficial, pushing you to maintain the highest standards even when creating arrows for routine use. You develop quality control procedures that ensure consistency across all your work, regardless of the arrow's intended purpose. This attention to detail becomes second nature, integrated into every step of your crafting process. Your grandfather begins sharing the most advanced secrets of arrow-making techniques and knowledge that are reserved for only the most skilled and trusted craftsmen. These might include specialized point designs for specific types of game, fletching configurations that provide advantages under certain conditions, or wood treatment methods that enhance durability and performance. These techniques are not secrets because they are dangerous, he explains as he demonstrates a particularly sophisticated fletching pattern. They are secrets because they require deep understanding to use properly. In the hands of someone who lacks that understanding, they might actually produce inferior results. Mastery isn't just about knowing techniques. It's about knowing when and how to apply them appropriately. This advanced knowledge comes with increased responsibility. You're now entrusted with preserving and transmitting some of your tribe's most valuable technical secrets. The arrows you create using these techniques must demonstrate their worth, proving that the knowledge has been passed to someone capable of using it wisely. As your reputation grows, you begin receiving commissions from prominent warriors and hunters who want arrows made specifically for important occasions. A war party leader requests arrows optimized for combat against human enemies. An elder hunter orders specialized projectiles for a ceremonial hunt marking his grandson's coming of age. Each commission presents unique challenges that expand your skills and understanding. These special projects often require innovations and adaptations that push the boundaries of traditional arrow making. You find yourself experimenting with new materials, modified designs, and novel construction techniques. Your grandfather encourages this experimentation, reminding you that tradition must grow and adapt to remain vital. Our ancestors were not afraid to try new things, he tells you as you work on an experimental arrow design. They developed our traditional methods through generations of trial and error, keeping what worked and discarding what didn't. Your generation must continue this process, building on our foundation while exploring new possibilities. The experimental arrows you create become testing grounds for new ideas and techniques. Some experiments fail, teaching you valuable lessons about the limits of materials and design principles. Others succeed, adding new tools to your arsenal of arrow-making knowledge. All of them contribute to your growing understanding of the complex relationships between design, materials, and performance. Your workshop becomes a center of innovation within your tribe's arrow-making community. Other craftsmen visit to see your latest creations and discuss new techniques. These exchanges of ideas and information benefit everyone involved, creating a collaborative environment that accelerates the development of new knowledge and capabilities. You begin keeping detailed records of your experiments and their results, creating a reference library that will benefit future generations of arrow makers. These records document not just successful techniques, but also failed experiments and the lessons learned from them. This comprehensive approach to knowledge preservation represents your contribution to the ongoing development of your craft. The passage of years brings changes to your role within the tribe's community. What began as a personal quest for mastery has evolved into a position of responsibility and leadership within the arrow-making tradition. Young warriors seek your guidance on equipment selection and modification. Experienced hunters consult with you on specialized projects. Even other craftsmen recognize your expertise and seek your advice on technical problems. This evolution brings new challenges and opportunities. You must balance the demands of individual projects with your responsibilities as a teacher and innovator. You must maintain the highest standards of craftsmanship while also exploring new possibilities and pushing the boundaries of what's possible with traditional materials and methods. Your grandfather, now advanced in years, begins transitioning more of his responsibilities to you. He still provides guidance and wisdom, but increasingly, you're the one making decisions about complex projects and difficult technical problems. This transition represents both an honor and a burden. You're being trusted with preserving and advancing knowledge that represents generations of accumulated wisdom. The responsibility becomes particularly acute when your grandfather begins sharing the most sacred aspects of arrow making, the spiritual and ceremonial dimensions that transform mere craftsmanship into something approaching art. These include the proper prayers and rituals that accompany each stage of arrow creation, the symbolic meanings embedded in different design elements, and the connections between arrow making and the tribe's broader spiritual beliefs. An arrow is more than wood and stone and feather, he explains during one of these sacred teachings. It carries the spirit of its maker, the blessing of the ancestors, and the hopes of the tribe. When you create an arrow, you're participating in a sacred act that connects the physical and spiritual worlds. This is why we approach our craft with reverence as well as skill. Understanding these spiritual dimensions adds new depth to your work. Each arrow becomes not just a tool, but a prayer made manifest in physical form. The attention to detail that you've always applied to technical aspects of arrow making now extends to the ceremonial and spiritual elements as well. Your arrows begin to reflect this deeper understanding, possessing a quality that transcends mere technical excellence. Other craftsmen notice this difference, recognizing something special in your work that goes beyond superior materials or flawless execution. Your reputation evolves from that of a skilled technician to that of a true master whose arrows embody the highest ideals of the craft. The transition to master status doesn't happen suddenly, but gradually, through the accumulation of knowledge, experience, and wisdom over many seasons of dedicated practice. One day you realize that apprentices now look at you the way you once looked at your grandfather, with respect, admiration, and the hope of learning the secrets of true mastery. This realization brings both pride and humility. Pride in the accomplishments that have earned you this recognition, but also humility in the face of how much more there is to learn. True mastery, you understand now, isn't a destination but a journey, one that continues throughout your life as you discover new challenges, explore new possibilities, and deepen your understanding of your craft. Your workshop becomes a pilgrimage destination for arrow makers from distant tribes who have heard of your innovations and expertise. These visits provide opportunities to learn about different approaches and techniques, expanding your knowledge beyond the traditions of your own people. The exchange of ideas and methods benefits everyone involved, creating a network of master craftsmen who push each other toward ever greater levels of excellence. Through these interactions, you begin to see your own tradition from new perspectives. Techniques that you've always taken for granted are revealed as innovations developed by your ancestors. Methods that seem naturally correct are shown to be choices made from among many possibilities. This broader perspective deepens your appreciation for the wisdom embedded in your tribe's traditional approaches, while also revealing opportunities for improvement and innovation. You begin incorporating selected elements from other traditions into your own work, creating hybrid techniques that combine the best aspects of different approaches. This synthesis requires careful judgment. Not all innovations represent improvements, and not all traditional methods should be abandoned simply because alternatives exist. The art lies in distinguishing between genuine improvements and mere novelty. Your experimental arrows that combine traditional and innovative elements become highly sought after by discriminating hunters and warriors. These projectiles represent the cutting edge of arrow-making technology, incorporating centuries of traditional wisdom with the latest innovations and improvements. They perform at levels that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of craftsmen. The success of these hybrid designs validates your approach of respectful innovation, building on traditional foundations while exploring new possibilities. This balance between conservation and innovation becomes a hallmark of your approach to arrow making and a model that other craftsmen begin to emulate. As the years pass, your reputation extends far beyond your own tribe and region. Stories of your exceptional arrows spread through trade networks and tribal gatherings, creating a legend that sometimes seems to take on a life of its own. Warriors journey great distances to commission arrows from your workshop, bringing exotic materials and challenging specifications that push your skills to new limits. Each of these challenging commissions teaches you something new about your craft and yourself. A request for arrows capable of penetrating metal armor forces you to explore new point designs and hafting techniques. An order for arrows optimized for use from horseback requires innovations in balance and aerodynamics. A commission for ceremonial arrows with specific symbolic requirements pushes you to integrate spiritual and aesthetic considerations with technical performance. These diverse projects prevent your skills from stagnating by constantly presenting new challenges and opportunities for growth. They also contribute to the advancement of arrow-making knowledge by forcing you to solve problems that haven't been addressed before. The solutions you develop often find applications in other projects, creating a synergistic effect that accelerates innovation. Your workshop begins to resemble a research center as much as a production facility. You maintain extensive collections of experimental arrows, test pieces, and reference materials. Your notes and sketches document thousands of observations and insights about materials, techniques, and performance characteristics. This accumulated knowledge represents one of the most comprehensive archives of arrow-making information ever assembled. The responsibility of maintaining and organizing this knowledge becomes increasingly important as your reputation grows and your archive expands. You develop systems for categorizing and cross-referencing information, making it easier to find relevant data when working on new projects. These organizational skills become as important as your technical abilities in managing the complexity of advanced arrow-making projects. Your grandfather, now quite elderly, but still sharp in mind and spirit, expresses satisfaction at seeing the knowledge he shared with you developed and expanded to such an extent. He recognizes that you've not just preserved the traditions he taught you, but have built upon them in ways that honor their spirit while extending their capabilities. The student has become the teacher. He observes one evening as you work together on a particularly challenging arrow design. But more than that, you've become an innovator and a preserver of knowledge. The craft is stronger because of your contributions, and future generations will benefit from the work you're doing now. This recognition from your first teacher and mentor represents one of the highest honors you could receive. It acknowledges not just your technical skills, but your role in the larger project of preserving and advancing traditional knowledge. You've become a link in the chain that connects past and future, ensuring that the wisdom of your ancestors will continue to benefit their descendants. The approaching end of your grandfather's life brings urgency to the task of preserving his remaining knowledge and insights. You spend long hours with him, recording not just technical information but also the stories, philosophies, and cultural contexts that give meaning to the craft. These conversations become some of your most treasured possessions, representing the last direct connection to the generation that taught you everything you know. When your grandfather finally joins the ancestors, you feel the full weight of responsibility for carrying forward the knowledge and traditions he embodied. You're now the senior arrow maker in your tribe, the keeper of ancient wisdom and the guide for future generations of craftsmen. The role brings both honor and burden, requiring you to balance your own creative pursuits with your responsibilities as a teacher and preserver of tradition. The memorial arrows you create to honor your grandfather's memory represent some of your finest work, combining technical excellence with deep emotional significance. These arrows embody everything he taught you about the craft, while also reflecting your own innovations and improvements. They serve as a tribute to his legacy, while also demonstrating how traditions can evolve and grow while maintaining their essential character. Your role as the tribe's master arrow maker continues to evolve as you age and your experience deepens. You take on more apprentices, passing on the knowledge that was shared with you, while also incorporating your own discoveries and innovations. Each new student brings fresh perspectives and challenges that prevent your own skills from becoming stagnant. The teaching process proves to be as educational for you as for your students. Explaining concepts forces you to examine your own understanding more deeply, often revealing insights that had remained unconscious through years of intuitive practice. The questions asked by curious apprentices sometimes point toward new areas of investigation or alternative approaches that you might not have considered otherwise. Your workshop becomes a thriving center of learning and innovation, where master and apprentice work together to push the boundaries of what's possible with traditional materials and methods. The collaborative atmosphere encourages experimentation and risk-taking while maintaining the high standards that have become your hallmark. The arrows produced in this environment represent the culmination of generations of accumulated wisdom, combined with fresh insights and innovative approaches. They perform at levels that would have seemed magical to earlier generations, yet they're built using materials and basic techniques that your ancestors would recognize and understand. This continuity between past and present becomes one of your greatest sources of satisfaction. You've managed to honor the traditions passed down to you while also advancing them in meaningful ways. The knowledge you'll leave to future generations is richer and more comprehensive than what you inherited. Yet it remains true to the fundamental principles and values that have always guided the arrow maker's craft. As you enter the later stages of your own life, you begin to see your role shifting once again. While you continue to create exceptional arrows and teach new apprentices, you also become increasingly focused on preserving and organizing the vast body of knowledge you've accumulated over decades of practice and experimentation. This preservation work involves not just recording technical information, but also capturing the cultural and spiritual contexts that give meaning to the craft. You document the stories, ceremonies, and philosophical frameworks that transform mere technical skill into true mastery. This holistic approach ensures that future generations will inherit not just the ability to make excellent arrows, but also the understanding necessary to continue developing and improving the craft. Your efforts to preserve and transmit knowledge extend beyond your own immediate students to include craftsmen from other tribes and regions. You participate in intertribal gatherings where arrow makers share techniques and insights, contributing to a broader community of practice that transcends local boundaries and tribal affiliations. These exchanges enrich everyone involved, creating a network of master craftsmen who support and challenge each other in the pursuit of excellence. The relationships you build through these interactions become some of your most valued possessions, representing connections to kindred spirits who share your passion for the craft and your commitment to its advancement. The arrows you create in collaboration with these distant masters represent fusion of different traditions and approaches, combining elements from multiple cultures and regions into hybrid designs that perform at unprecedented levels. These collaborative projects demonstrate the power of shared knowledge and open communication in advancing technical capabilities. Your reputation as a master arrow maker and teacher eventually reaches legendary status, with stories of your exceptional arrows and innovative techniques spreading far beyond the regions where you're personally known. Young craftsmen make pilgrimages to study with you, bringing offerings and trade goods in exchange for instruction in your methods. The responsibility of living up to this legendary reputation proves both motivating and challenging. Every arrow you create must demonstrate the exceptional quality that has made your name famous. Every student you teach carries your reputation into the world through their own work and teaching. The standards you maintain in your workshop influence the quality of arrow making across vast regions. This widespread influence brings both satisfaction and pressure. You take pride in knowing that your innovations and improvements are being adopted by craftsmen throughout the known world, raising the overall quality of arrows and improving the effectiveness of hunters and warriors everywhere. At the same time, you feel the weight of responsibility for maintaining standards worthy of the trust that has been placed in you. The advanced age that brings wisdom and perspective also brings physical limitations that gradually affect your ability to perform the most demanding aspects of arrow making. The fine motor control required for delicate pressure flaking becomes more difficult. The strength needed for extensive napping sessions diminishes. The endurance necessary for long days in the workshop decreases. Rather than seeing these changes as limitations, you adapt your role to focus on areas where experience and knowledge matter more than physical capability. You spend more time teaching and mentoring, passing on insights that can only come from decades of practice. You focus on design and planning activities that leverage your accumulated wisdom. You take on advisory roles that influence the work of younger craftsmen without requiring you to perform all the physical labor yourself. This transition proves to be as rewarding as any other phase of your career. The satisfaction of seeing your knowledge and innovations carried forward by capable students rivals the pride you once took in creating exceptional arrows with your own hands. The influence you exercise through teaching and mentoring extends your impact far beyond what you could achieve through individual craftsmanship alone. Your workshop becomes increasingly focused on research and development activities that push the boundaries of arrow-making knowledge. You experiment with new materials, as they become available through trade networks. You explore theoretical questions about aerodynamics and projectile physics that your practical experience has raised. You investigate connections between aeromaking and other crafts that might offer insights or techniques worth adapting. These research activities often involve collaboration with younger craftsmen who provide the physical capabilities needed to test new ideas and approaches. The partnership between your theoretical knowledge and their practical skills proves highly productive, generating innovations that neither could achieve working alone. The arrows produced through these collaborative research projects represent the cutting edge of the craft, incorporating insights and techniques that won't become widely known for years to come. They serve as proof of concept demonstrations for new approaches and as training tools for students who will carry these innovations into the broader world of aeromaking. Your role as an elder master brings you into contact with other senior craftsmen and tribal leaders who recognize your expertise and seek your advice on matters beyond aeromaking. Your reputation for wisdom and judgment, built through decades of careful work and thoughtful teaching, makes you a respected voice in discussions about technology, training, and cultural preservation. This broader influence allows you to advocate for the importance of traditional crafts and the knowledge they embody. You argue for the value of maintaining ancient skills even as new technologies become available. You emphasize the cultural and spiritual dimensions of craftsmanship that transcend mere technical utility. You work to ensure that the wisdom accumulated over generations isn't lost in the rush toward novelty and change. Your advocacy proves effective in preserving support for traditional aeromaking and other ancestral crafts. Your arguments about the practical, cultural, and spiritual value of these skills convince tribal leaders to continue supporting the training of new craftsmen and the preservation of ancient knowledge. The arrows you create during this later phase of your career often take on ceremonial and symbolic significance that transcends their practical utility. These pieces represent the culmination of a lifetime's learning and experience, embodying not just technical excellence, but also cultural and spiritual meaning that speaks to the deepest values of your people. The creation of these masterwork arrows becomes increasingly ritualized, involving ceremonies and observances that acknowledge their significance as cultural artifacts, as well as functional tools. The time and care invested in their creation reflects their importance as repositories of ancestral wisdom and artistic achievement. Each of these masterwork arrows tells a story of the tree that provided its shaft, of the bird that contributed its feathers, of the stone that became its point, of the craftsman who assembled these elements into a functional whole. These stories become part of the arrow's identity, adding layers of meaning that enrich its cultural significance. The preservation of these stories, along with the technical knowledge needed to create such arrows, becomes one of your primary concerns as you enter the twilight of your career. You work to ensure that future generations will inherit not just the physical artifacts you've created, but also the knowledge and cultural context necessary to understand and appreciate them. Your legacy as a master arrow maker extends far beyond the individual arrows you've created. Exceptional though they may be, your innovations and improvements have influenced the work of countless other craftsmen. Your teaching has preserved and transmitted knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Your research has expanded the boundaries of what's possible within the traditional framework of the craft. Perhaps most importantly, Your example has demonstrated that tradition and innovation need not be in conflict. Through your work, you've shown that respect for ancestral wisdom and openness to new possibilities can coexist productively. Your career represents a model for how traditional crafts can evolve and grow while maintaining their essential character and cultural significance. The arrows you've created will continue to serve hunters and warriors long after you've joined the ancestors. But your true legacy lies in the knowledge you've preserved and advanced, the students you've trained, and the standards of excellence you've established. These contributions will influence arrow making for generations to come, ensuring that the craft continues to develop and flourish. As you sit by your fire on this quiet evening, examining the latest arrow to emerge from your workshop, you reflect on the journey that began so many years ago with a young man's desire to create the perfect hunting projectile. That simple goal has expanded into a lifetime's work that has touched every aspect of your existence and influenced the lives of countless others. The arrow in your hands represents not just the culmination of months of careful work, but the distillation of decades of accumulated knowledge and experience. Every curve of its shaft, every placement of its fletching, every facet of its point reflects lessons learned through years of patient practice and thoughtful experimentation. Tomorrow will bring new projects and fresh challenges, continuing the endless cycle of learning and improvement that defines the arrow maker's craft. But tonight, in the quiet warmth of your workshop, surrounded by the tools and materials that have been your companions for so many years, you find deep satisfaction in the knowledge that you've contributed something meaningful to the great tradition of which you're a part. The soft light of the fire dances across the surface of your latest creation, highlighting the subtle perfections that mark it as the work of a true master. In a few days, this arrow will leave your workshop to serve a hunter in pursuit of game that will feed his family through the coming winter. It will carry with it not just your technical skill, but also the accumulated wisdom of all the craftsmen who came before you and the hopes of all those who will follow. This is the true magic of the arrow maker's art. The ability to invest simple materials with complex meanings, to transform wood and stone and feather into instruments that connect past and future, tradition and innovation, the practical and the sacred. Through your arrows, something of your spirit will continue to influence the world long after your physical presence has ended. The fire burns low as night settles over your village, and you finally set aside your work for the day. The arrow rests in its place among the others, awaiting completion, each one a testament to the patience, skill, and dedication that define your craft. As you prepare for sleep, you carry with you the satisfaction of work well done and the anticipation of challenges yet to come. In your dreams, you sometimes return to that first arrow, the one that taught you so much about yourself and your capabilities. You remember the uncertainty and excitement of those early days, when every step was new and every technique was a revelation. That young craftsman could never have imagined the journey that lay ahead, the heights of mastery that awaited, the influence his work would have on future generations. But perhaps that's as it should be. The arrow maker's path, like the flight of a perfectly crafted arrow, reveals itself one moment at a time, guided by skill and preparation, but ultimately following a trajectory that can't be fully predicted or controlled. The joy lies not in reaching a predetermined destination, but in the journey itself, in the daily practice of the craft, in the pursuit of ever greater excellence, in the satisfaction of work that honors both tradition and innovation. As sleep takes hold, Your last conscious thought is of tomorrow's work, another arrow to be begun, another opportunity to apply the knowledge you've accumulated, another chance to contribute to the great tradition that has shaped your life and given it meaning. The cycle continues, as it has for countless generations before you, and will for countless generations to come, each craftsman adding their own contributions to the ever-growing body of knowledge and wisdom that defines the arrow maker's art. You drift into peaceful sleep, your hands still carrying the memory of wood and stone and sinew, your mind filled with the quiet satisfaction that comes from a life dedicated to the pursuit of perfection in service of others. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight you rest in the knowledge that you've played your part in preserving and advancing one of humanity's oldest and most essential crafts. The embers of your fire settle into glowing coals that will keep the workshop warm through the night, ready to be rekindled when morning comes and the work begins anew. In the darkness, your completed arrows stand silent sentinel over the tools and materials that will soon be transformed into new projectiles, each one carrying forward the ancient wisdom and timeless dedication that define the arrow maker's eternal quest for perfection. Outside, the wind whispers through the trees that will someday provide wood for future arrows, while somewhere in the forest, birds roost whose feathers may one day guide those arrows to their targets. The great cycle of creation and use, tradition and innovation, teaching and learning continues its endless dance, and you rest peacefully in the knowledge that you've contributed your part to this magnificent, timeless symphony of human skill and dedication. And so ends another day in the life of a master arrow maker. But the story itself continues in the arrows you've created, in the knowledge you've preserved, in the students you've taught, and in the tradition you've helped to nurture and advance. The perfect arrow may remain forever just beyond reach, but the pursuit of that perfection gives meaning and purpose to every day spent in service of the craft.